Welcome, deep divers. Ever get completely drawn into the story of a legend? Not just someone undeniably great, but someone whose whole legacy is, well, wrapped up in debate.
Oh, absolutely. Where their strengths are argued about just as much as their impact is celebrated. It's kind of human nature, isn't it?
It really is. We love those big stories, but we're also pulled towards the whispers of doubt, the things that make us look again, because usually under that shiny surface of influence, there's this whole cloud of conflicting ideas pushing us to dig deeper.
Exactly. The idea of greatness itself often comes with these built-in challenges. It forces you to juggle contradictions, to accept complexity, instead of just wanting a neat, simple story. The really impactful figures. They pretty much always have their critics or moments where people question their resolve.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today. We're exploring the fascinating and, often contested legacy of a dog named Bullyson. And this isn't just about one, incredible animal. It's really about a key moment, a turning point in the history of the American Pit Bull Terrier. It's about how ideas around a really crucial trait, what the community calls gameness, started to fundamentally shift.
It's a perfect case study, really. It shows so much about how these specialized groups define and then challenge and sometimes completely redefine what they value most.
So our main guide for getting into all this is a really insightful article called Walling's BULLYSON ROM. It's written by Gary Hammonds.
Yeah, and what makes Hammond's perspective so valuable, and he says this himself, is that he's an outsider. He says he has no axe to grind.
Right. No personal stake in a specific bloodline or outcome.
Exactly. Which is huge because this topic, Bullysons himself, it generates intense passion, really strong feelings, conflicting views, especially among people who are close to it or have a stake in the breed's history. So Hammond's detachment, it allows for this potentially unbiased look, which is honestly pretty rare and incredibly valuable in this kind of discussion.
Absolutely. That's why we're focusing on his work. So our mission today, we're going to unpack Hammonds Analysis, really get into the nuts and bolts of it, pull out his core arguments, the surprising things he noticed, and the kind of underlying philosophy that shaped how people saw Bullyson, how they bred him, and ultimately how he changed the breed.
And we'll dig into why those questions about Bullyson's gameness became such a big deal, even with his undeniable, almost legendary influence on generations of these dogs. It's a story full of nuance, history, genetics, changing perceptions. It's all in there.
Okay, let's set the scene. Hammond kicks things off by introducing Bullyson and his half-brother, Eli Jr. He calls them an extraordinary pair of dogs.
Yeah, he doesn't hold back. Says they stood head and shoulders above the competition of their day. That's a strong statement right out of the gate.
It really paints a picture, doesn't it? Like immediate, obvious dominance. When these two showed up, people just knew they were different, operating on another level.
And what's really interesting there, that immediate impact, it already hints at this shift in how dogs were being judged. What traits were starting to bubble up is most important. They were just so exceptional, so physically imposing, they couldn't be ignored. And Hammond points out something crucial, often missed. Bullyson was bred a lot to some of the best females around before his big famous loss.
Before Benny Bob.
Really?
Yeah. Think about that. It shows this deep-seated belief in his qualities, his power, his genetics. Even if there were maybe some whispers or early questions about his gameness already floating around, people saw something undeniable in him, something that went beyond any single perceived flaw. They believed he could pass on those amazing traits no matter how his own career ended up.
That's a huge point. His value as a stud was locked in early, based on that sheer presence and his wins. But then Hammond lays out this clash happening around the idea of gameness. You had the old-timers with their traditional views.
Right, the established school of thought.
And then this new breed of dogmen coming up with a different perspective. Exactly. And for the old-timers, gameness was everything.
Yeah.
Their definition was super strict. They'd see these incredibly fierce dogs, barn-storming, hard-biting dogs.
Powerful dogs.
Absolutely. Even stifle-eating dogs. Which, just for clarity, stifle eating is a particularly brutal tactic, attacking the knee joint in the hind leg. Crippling.
Oof.
But even if a dog did all that, was physically devastating, if it didn't have that absolute grit, that refusal to quit no matter what, the old-timers might just call it a cur.
Cur. That was the worst thing you could call a dog.
The absolute worst. It didn't mean weak, it meant lacking heart. A dog that would stop when things got really tough. For them, value is proven in those long, grueling tests of spirit. Not just quick wins. It was about endurance, the will to go to the bitter end.
So it wasn't about the fast finish. It was about lasting the distance, proving that spirit. But then the new breed comes along. What were they seeing differently?
Yeah, this emerging group started to appreciate a dog that could get the job done in short order. Their focus shifted. While spirit still mattered, their idea of gameness broadened. It became more pragmatic, more results-focused.
How so?
Well, they started thinking, if a dog has such overwhelming power and technique that it just crushes its opponent quickly, maybe in just a few minutes. So that long, drawn-out test of traditional gameness never even really happens. Isn't that its own kind of superior gameness?
Ah, right. Effectiveness, efficiency.
Exactly. A dog that wins decisively and fast, minimizing the whole ordeal.
That's a massive shift in thinking. It's like valuing the sprinter's explosive power just as much as the marathoner's endurance.
Yeah.
Both are dominant, just different ways of getting there.
Precisely. And what's really telling is Hammond observing that even some of the old-timers were beginning to change their thinking to varying degrees.
So it wasn't just the young guys.
No. It signals this wasn't just a fad, but a real, if maybe slow and reluctant, evolution within the community's core thinking.
Why do you think that happened?
Well, likely because the direct experience with dogs like Bullyson and Eli Jr., who embodied this quick, decisive power, was just undeniable. Even the old guard couldn't ignore how effective it was. It forced them to reconsider if that long battle was the only measure, or if ending things quickly on your own terms was maybe just as valuable, just a different kind of game.
Which really makes you think, doesn't it? How different eras, different ways of thinking, new experiences in any specialized field, dog breeding, martial arts, sports analytics, how they lead to different interpretations of what's superior. It shows how definitions, even for something like gameness, evolve. They aren't static. They're shaped by experience, and what people observe actually works.
It's a great example of how challenging the old norms, embracing new ways, often leads to progress or at least adaptation. Bullyson's time was definitely a crucible for these ideas. The whole definition of a great dog was being debated right there in the pit.
Okay, so we've got the context, Bullyson's early impact, the shifting ideas about gameness. Now let's get into his actual performances, because this is where the theories meet reality, where wins built the legend, but one loss sparked all those doubts.
And Hammond's perspective here is gold, because, as he says, he's seen Bullyson win and lose.
Right, not just stories, but eyewitness testimony. That gives his analysis real weight.
Totally. So he talks about Bullyson's win over SIRHAN. He describes it as not as devastating as most expected.
Okay, so maybe not the overwhelming victory people anticipated.
Right, which immediately raises a question mark. But Hammond offers an explanation.
Yeah.
He suggests that SIRHAN was a better dog than he had been given credit for being.
So it wasn't necessarily Bullyson being off his game.
Exactly. It was more like, hey, don't underestimate the opponent. This reframes the win not as subpar, but as a victory against a tough, underestimated dog. It protects Bullyson's reputation a bit there.
Gotcha. Clever analysis. But then we get to the big one, the match that really lit the fuse on the gameness debate. The loss to his own son, Benny Bob.
Yeah. And Hammond frames it immediately. Not only ironic, but sad. The irony is obvious, sire beaten by his son. The sadness captures that emotional weight of seeing a legend fall like that. It's pure drama.
It really is. And Hammond describes how Benny Bob seemed to neutralize and outdo his stale-looking sire's best moves.
Stale-looking. That phrase is powerful. It suggests maybe Bullyson wasn't just physically outmatched, but maybe tactically outdone too. Like the younger dog had figured him out, or Bullyson was just past his peak, lacking that edge.
The changing of the guard, almost.
Could be seen that way. And the physical decline Hammond saw was stark. He says it was obvious Bully could not win long before it was over. He describes Bullyson slipping in and out of shock as the end drew near.
Wow. That's graphic.
It's agonizing. It wasn't a sudden thing. It was this visible, slow decline right in front of everyone. And that feeds directly into the gameness debate. Was he just physically spent, or did the will falter too?
So how did the crowd react, seeing this invincible figure just crumble?
Hammond says, his loss left the crowd scratching their heads in disbelief. Just sheer shock. Imagine the expectations for Bullyson and then seeing that, especially against his own son.
Unbelievable.
And the scene after is so poignant. The old warrior was laid under a shade tree on that hot July day as the boys from Houston and San Antonio surveyed the scene. It's this image of respect, even in defeat, but also this moment of collective, stunned reflection, like an era just ended.
That image really sticks with you, the fallen champion. But then, years later, this other wrinkle appears. Maurice claiming Bullyson lost to a rub? What's that about?
Yeah, the rub claim adds another layer of intrigue. A rub implies something wasn't right. Maybe a fixed match, maybe unfair handling, maybe some accident or injury right before or doing that wasn't obvious. It suggests the loss wasn't just a straight-up defeat based on performance or gameness.
So it's an alternative explanation.
Exactly. An attempt, maybe years later, to make sense of a shocking outcome. And Hammond handles it carefully. He presents it as a possibility Maurice raised, something that could have been the case. But he doesn't definitively say it was the case. He includes it as part of the whole complex story, acknowledging these conflicting theories exist. It's part of the Bullyson lore now.
And that brings us back to that core question. How does one defining loss, especially one with controversy attached, affect how we see a dominant figure, like a great athlete having one terrible game? These alternative stories, like the rub, they don't just disappear, do they? They linger. They offer a way to maybe soften the blow, to keep debating the what-ifs. It's how legends and their flaws get discussed and reinterpreted over time.
Absolutely. It speaks to that human need to understand, maybe even rationalize, when things don't meet our expectations of greatness. The ambiguity around Bullyson's loss just becomes another part of his enduring legend.
Okay, so we've covered the performances, the win, the devastating loss, the questions around his personal gameness. But here's where Hammonds' analysis gets really fascinating. He shifts to the genetic legacy Bullyson's kids.
Right, the progeny. And this is where the gameness puzzle gets seriously reconsidered.
Hammond makes this strong statement, basically saying, forget any doubts about Bullyson himself for a second, because some of those dogs sired by Bullyson were great, to say the least.
Yeah, that immediately pushes back on the idea that Bullyson's own issues meant his whole line was flawed. His kids were undeniably successful. The proof was right there.
And who does he highlight first?
Benny Bob, ironically enough, the son who beat him. But he points out Benny Bob had his own solid career, even losing a really close match to another top dog, Jimmy Boots, one that could have went either way.
So Benny Bob wasn't just a fluke against his dad, he was genuinely good.
Exactly. Hammond establishes him as a top-tier competitor in his own right. And he even quotes Ralph, Jimmy Boots' handler, or the opponent's handler, saying he would have been proud to bring other dog home after that match.
Wow, praise from the other side. That carries weight.
Huge weight. It confirms Benny Bob was the real deal. And Hammond doesn't stop there. He lists others he saw personally. Stomper, Bullyson Jr., Jeremiah. He calls them dogs worth feeding.
Which sounds simple, but in that world, worth feeding is a big compliment.
It's a huge compliment. It means they had the right stuff, the physical ability, the drive, the resilience traits you want to invest in, breed forward. They consistently showed the quality breeders were looking for, confirming the strength in Bullyson's genes.
Okay, but here's the real mind-bender, the core of this gameness percentage paradox that Hammond observes. He admits, yeah, some pups were amazing, some just average, like any litter, but then he drops this bombshell. The percentage of game dogs among them were as high as most families being bred at the time.
This is it. This is the absolute crux of Hammond's argument.
Break that down. How can a dog whose own gameness was questioned produce game offspring at the same rate as lines famous for gameness?
It's a fantastic paradox, right? It completely challenges that simple idea that if the sire has a perceived flaw, it just gets passed down directly, weakening the line for that trait. It suggests gameness isn't just one simple on-off gene inherited from one parent.
So it's not like dad quit so the kids will quit.
Not necessarily, no. It complicates things hugely.
Right.
It implies that while Bullyson's individual performance that one day might have been questionable due to various factors, age, conditions, stress, whatever, his underlying genetic contribution to gameness was still incredibly strong.
So the genes he passed on were solid for gameness, even if his own display wasn't perfect that day.
That's the implication. When those genes combine with different dams, different genetics, or maybe when the offspring were raised or conditioned differently, they produced game dogs at a consistent high rate. It separates the dog's single performance under specific circumstances from its overall genetic potential to produce that trait.
So, thinking bigger picture, how can a sire with questioned traits still pass on good stuff so reliably? What does that tell us about genetics or breeding? Or even just evaluating potential in general?
It tells us you have to look beyond one event, one perceived flaw. You have to look at the bigger genetic picture, the interactions, the overall results across a whole line. An individual might falter due to circumstance, but their underlying genetic blueprint might still be overwhelmingly positive for certain traits.
Like in any field, right? One bad day doesn't define someone's entire capability.
Exactly. It argues for looking at the difference between performance in one moment and underlying capacity or potential. especially with complex traits like gameness, which are probably polygenic, influenced by many genes and heavily affected by environment. A single poor showing doesn't automatically doom the whole bloodline for that trait if the underlying genetics are strong overall. It demands a more holistic view.
That's really insightful. It argues against oversimplifying biology, really. There's always more going on beneath the surface. So we've got Bullyson's impact, the success of his kids, challenging the gameness idea. But now let's really get inside Hammond's thinking, because he offers this really nuanced breakdown of what gameness even is. He moves way beyond just yes or no.
Yeah, he starts with this broader point. Almost all great dogs are questioned by some as not being dead game.
So it's not just Bullyson, it's common for the greats.
He positions it almost like an occupational hazard. If you're a legend, someone, somewhere is going to question your ultimate commitment. It comes with the territory of being under that intense scrutiny.
Okay.
And then he drops his core philosophy. Gameness is somewhat relative to many factors or combination of these. He's saying it's not absolute, it depends.
Relative. That's a big shift from the old Kerr definition, which felt absolute. So relative to what? What are these factors?
He lists several key things. First, time. A dog's performance, its apparent gameness, changes over its career. Prime years versus older, more battered years, like any athlete.
Makes sense.
Second, place. Where the match happens matters. Familiar turf versus strange, stressful location. Comfort level, distractions, it all plays a role. Third, environment. Broader conditions. Like, remember, Bullyson's loss was on a hot July day. Extreme heat can drain anyone, dog or human, affect their willingness to push through. Terrain, flooring, noise too.
So external conditions are huge. It's not just internal will.
Exactly. Fourth, the condition of the animal. Health, training level, hidden injuries, age. If a dog is out of shape or hurt, it might look like it's quitting, but it might just be physically unable to continue, even if the spirit is there. That stale-looking comment about Bullyson fits right here.
Right.
And fifth, the type of stress. The opponent's style matters. A dog might be super game against one type of fighter, but struggle against another. And Hammond uses that phrase, check a dog's oil.
Check its oil. What does that mean?
It's like saying these factors, time, place, conditions, stress, they're the real tests. They reveal what the dog is really capable of under pressure, and that can vary wildly depending on the specific test.
Like testing a car on different roads and different weather after different maintenance levels. Its performance changes based on the conditions.
Perfect analogy. And Hammond pushes this further by talking about how inconsistent gameness can be, even in the same dog.
How so?
He says, many dogs have shown to be short of gameness at one time and come back to show dead game at a later date. So a dog might seem to fail once, then show incredible gameness later.
Okay.
But also the reverse. Others have shown exceptional gameness one day and later quit cold.
Wow. So it's not fixed at all. It's dynamic.
That's his point. It completely challenges the idea of gameness as this unchanging inherent trait. It suggests it's an expression influenced by all those variables, not a permanent label. A dog appearing to quit once doesn't mean it's not game, and vice versa.
You know, this nuanced view applies so broadly, doesn't it? Outside of dogs entirely. Evaluating performance or character in any field, it pushes for a more holistic, maybe more forgiving, less judgmental view. You wouldn't judge an athlete's whole career on one bad game if you knew they were injured, or dealing with personal stuff, or just caught on a bad day. It makes you ask why something happened, not just what happened.
Exactly. It moves away from black and white labels towards a more realistic, contextual understanding. Recognizing performance is complex, dynamic, and what you see is just a snapshot influenced by countless factors.
Okay, so we have evolving definitions, the genetic paradox, Hammond's relative view of gameness, but there's this one specific conversation Hammond had that really shows the strategic shifts happening in breeding. He talks about meeting with Maurice back in the 70s.
Right, a pivotal conversation.
And Hammond admits, even with all his insights, he was still apprehensive about using the bully stuff in his own breeding. Why? Because of those lingering gameness concerns.
Yeah, it shows how powerful that reputation, that cloud of doubt around Bullyson still was, even for someone analytical like Hammond. But Maurice, he had a different, very pragmatic take.
What did Maurice say?
He basically cuts right through Hammond's hesitation. He says, hell, son, you breed that to those alligator dogs, and you'll have the roughest SOBs that ever came down the pike.
Whoa, okay. Direct. Alligator dogs. That's another famous line known for being tough.
Well, extremely tough. Known for aggression, bite, tenacity. So Maurice is proposing this power-packed combination focused purely on creating overwhelming roughness, meaning brutal effectiveness, finishing power.
Roughest SOBs. That's a clear goal. But then Maurice says something even more revealing, anticipating Hammond's worry about gameness.
This is the absolute key moment in Hammond's article, revealing Maurice's whole strategy. He looks at Hammond, pauses maybe, and then just lays it out. Now, you may lose some gameness, but you will probably never know it if they are as rough as I figured they will be.
Wow. Okay, unpack that. Lose gameness, but never know it.
It's pure pragmatism. Maurice is saying, yeah, maybe breeding purely for this overwhelming roughness, this immediate destructive power you get combining Bullysons and alligator lines, maybe it dilutes that traditional long-haul gameness slightly. But if the dogs are so devastatingly effective, so powerful, that they end the fight in minutes,
then that traditional long-form gameness never actually gets tested anyway.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The situation where you need that hour-long display of grit might just never happen because the dog overwhelms the opponent too quickly. It's optimizing for efficiency and sheer force.
It's a strategic trade-off. Sacrificing a bit of one trait because you believe another trait is so strong it makes the first one irrelevant in practice.
Precisely. It marks a huge shift from valuing endurance above all to prioritizing immediate, decisive power as the primary path to winning. It redefines what victory requires in that context.
That's a brilliant, maybe even ruthless example of strategic thinking in a competitive world. It makes you think about trade-offs everywhere, right? Building a team, designing a product. When do you prioritize one strength knowing it might slightly weaken another because you bet that first strength will be overwhelming?
It is. It's a calculated risk based on observation, betting that sheer power bypasses the need for the old test of gameness. Maurice's vision, apparently delivered with real conviction, really did change how people thought about breeding, prioritizing efficiency, even if it departed from the older ideals. Sometimes innovation is just pragmatic reevaluation.
Okay, we've hit the genetics, the breeding strategy shifts, but we can't wrap up Bullyson without touching on his own personal intensity, his ferocity.
Right, the legend of the individual dog.
Hammond mentions the Bobby Hall stories, things like Hall having to chunk Bully his feed, just toss it to him, or even getting on cars and climbing trees to get away from him.
These stories paint this picture of a genuinely dangerous, formidable animal, not just in the pit, but just as an individual. It speaks to this raw, almost untamed power.
It explains why his presence alone was so intimidating. But Hammond adds a crucial clarification right after.
Yes, very important. He qualifies it. Bully did not produce a high percentage of man-eaters, to my knowledge.
Man-eaters meaning aggressive towards humans specifically.
Exactly. Indiscriminate aggression towards people. So while Bullyson himself was intense and potentially dangerous to handle, that specific trait wasn't necessarily passed down strongly or frequently. It's a key distinction between the individual's temperament and the overall genetic legacy for that trait. Not everything gets passed on equally.
That's vital context, separating the individual legend from the progeny's reality. And then Hammond adds this really provocative personal thought about the loss to Benny Bob. He says, if he had been mine during these times, he would have never had to worry about Benny Bob killing him.
It's a striking comment, isn't it, coming from him?
What do you think he means by that?
It suggests Hammond believed Bullyson's raw power, his ferocity, maybe if he'd been conditioned differently or was just in peak form without being stale, he would have overwhelmed Benny Bob. That the loss wasn't maybe the final word on Bullyson's intrinsic quality, but more about circumstance or handling or condition that day. It's almost like saying Bullyson had more in the tank, it just wasn't brought out properly in that fight, a sort of what if.
A lament for untapped potential in that final match. Powerful thought. And all this analysis, all these layers, lead Hammond to his final sweeping conclusion about Bullyson's impact.
Yeah, he lands it with real force. I believe I'm conservative in saying that no dog since Debo has had a greater impact on the bulldog of today than Bullyson.
Since Debo, that's putting him right at the top tier of foundational dogs.
Absolutely. He's saying despite the debates, the loss, the questions, Bullyson's genetic influence on the modern APBT is just massive, maybe unparalleled in recent history. He fundamentally shaped the breed's landscape.
And he includes Eli Jr. too, right? Reinforcing their combined effect.
Yes, he adds, throw Eli JR in the equation, and there is no doubt these two brothers changed a great deal of how dogmen everywhere looked at and feel about the greatest breed on earth today. So it was this 1-2 punch. These two brothers together forced a reevaluation, changed how people bred, what they valued, pushing the breed towards new standards, new philosophies. Their combined legacy just rewrote the playbook.
They didn't just add a chapter, they reshaped the whole story. Their influence is still felt today.
Undeniably.
Yeah.
They forced that massive reevaluation of traits, strategy, everything. An indelible mark.
Wow. This deep dive into Bullyson's world, guided by Gary Hammonds' really sharp analysis, has been quite a ride. From the gameness debates and that pivotal loss, through the surprising success of his kids, to this much more nuanced relative view of gameness itself. Hammond's perspective really shows how legends, especially controversial ones, can shape the future in unexpected ways, forcing us to rethink what greatness and influence really mean.
Yeah, the key takeaways are pretty clear. First, that idea of gameness being relative, dynamic, influenced by so many factors: time, place, condition, stress, not just fixed.
Right.
Second, that strategic shift towards prioritizing roughness, immediate effectiveness, even if it meant trading off some traditional endurance-based gameness, a very pragmatic change.
Okay.
And finally, just the undeniable massive impact of Bullyson and Eli Jr. together.
Yeah.
They truly transformed the breed, how people thought about it, how they bred it.
And exploring Bullyson's story with all its complexities really makes you ponder that bigger question, doesn't it? How do we balance perceived flaws, those moments of doubt, against undeniable impact when we look at influential figures, whether it's dogs, sports stars, business leaders?
Yeah.
What does great really mean when the definitions themselves keep shifting? It's definitely something to chew on after we finish up here.
It's a fantastic question. Challenges us to move past simple stories and embrace the messy reality of legacy and influence.
And hey, if you love the American Pit Bull Terrier, if its history fascinates you, or if this deep dive just got you more curious, we really recommend checking out the community at APBT Info.
Yeah, it's a great place. Lots of resources, good discussions, great way to connect with other people passionate about the breed and its history. You can definitely continue your own deep dive there.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive today.
Been great discussing it.
Until next time.